Welcome back, listeners, to The History Blokes, the podcast where we discuss strange facts, interesting stories and fascinating people from Australia's history that we think you ought to know. We're coming to you from a glorious sunny afternoon here in Ngunnawal Country, Canberra. And Conan, we've gotten to our 1,000th download.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's very exciting.
I'd like to thank all of our listeners out there. I think we might have 5 now, but I do appreciate your...
You think five listeners downloading 200 times each?
Well, you've got to take the downloads that I undertake out of that equation, of course. But look, it is a big milestone for us, and we do thank everybody who's been listening to our podcast over the last 6 or 7 months. If you're enjoying our podcast, we've established a coffee account where, should you wish, you'd be welcome to make a small donation just to cover our, coffee effectively.
Yeah, that's right.
If you'd like,
there are costs associated with podcasts. So if you felt like contributing, because the thing about the History Blokes, Chris, is that there are no ads, are there?
There are no ads at all.
It's just pure listening pleasure, and. So, if you just want to help us out, that'd be good. So, the URL, Chris?
Indeed. The URL is coffee, that's ko-fi.com/historyblokes.
And you can also leave a message, and if you want to make a suggestion about a topic we could cover, feel free to do that. We can't guarantee we'll act on your suggestion, but it's a way of having input into this quality podcast.
And we would love your feedback, irrespective.
Well... yeah, depending on the feedback. Very much depending on the feedback.
We would love your positive, endorsing feedback.
Yes, because we have fragile egos.
Indeed. So, and what are we going to cover today?
Chris, we're going to be looking at the development of penicillin by an Australian. Well, he was one of 3 people. I'm talking about Harold Florey, who during the Second World War developed penicillin along with a German called Ernst Chain, I think that's how you pronounce it, based on the work, of course, of Alexander Fleming, the Scot. So very much a multinational effort. And then they took that to the Americans to actually get it made at an industrial level ahead of D-Day.
Wow.
That was their kind of self-imposed deadline.
I can only imagine what a game changer in modern medicine. And we could talk about the wonders of antibiotics, and we could talk about some of the troubles that we're facing into the future.
That, yeah.
But it's a marvelous piece of medical history.
Yes, it was the first antibiotic, very effective against diseases that up until then had been devastating, but now are considered to be fairly minor. But before we get into that, Chris, we're going to go to the quiz, and we're going to be focusing on diseases, appropriately enough.
It's an area of specialty for me.
Yeah, is it?
No.
Well, you're good at contracting them off your child.
That's right. Other than contracting them off my 18-month-old toddler,
who we can hear in the background.
We can hear in the background. Sure, I think for the second episode running. So I've become much more familiar with disease in the last 6 months or so since he went to daycare than previously.
Yeah. First question, Chris: smallpox. Who developed the vaccine for it? When and how?
Okay. Smallpox. I'm going to say Louis Pasteur. No, God, I don't know. I'm all over the place.
I mean,
I know the story, the milkmaid story.
Yeah,
of course. Yeah,
which is a myth. Yes.
Is it a myth?
It's apparently a myth.
Oh my God. Okay.
So the man that you're looking for, I mean, you're right. You're correct gender. He was.
Was he at least French?
He was not French. He was English. So correct continent. He was Edward Jenner. And he developed the first vaccine in 1796. You obviously are vaguely familiar with the story. So he recognized that cowpox, which is an innocuous related disease, viral disease, that if you're inoculated against cowpox, then you can also be inoculated against smallpox. So the way he did this was to take an 8-year-old child, a local peasant's son.
Of course.
Yes.
For the experiment.
Different times. And he inoculated him against cowpox, then exposed him to basically pustules containing smallpox. The child did not get sick from the smallpox exposure. Because up until then, they had been exposing people to smallpox in the form of pustules as a primitive form of developing inoculation.
And people were keeling over?
Sometimes. I mean, you are better off getting that than running a risk of contracting smallpox, but you could still die of it. But cowpox vaccination was a safe way of protecting yourself from smallpox. He was able to demonstrate that, and it has been said that he has saved more lives as a result than any other human being in history. Question 2. What was the Great Stink, and how was it resolved?
Now, I'm going to guess. I'm going to make a cholera suggestion there. The Great Stink is where they thought the cholera was airborne versus it being water.
Yes.
There was this, if I recall, around London, there were outbreaks of cholera, which are all associated with groundwater from certain wells, some of which you can still find in London, which is really interesting. They still got, I think, some of the original wells.
Sort of water pumps.
That's correct.
Really?
It was a red herring. So it sent people worried that it was all about, protecting what you're breathing in.
Miasma theory.
Miasma theory, exactly, versus what you're drinking.
Yeah. So how was it resolved?
I think eventually they built the London sewer system, if I recall.
Very good. I'm going to give you that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And they realised that there was a mixing, obviously, of groundwater with sewage.
And who's they? When you say they realised that? There was a particular individual.
It was an engineer, was it?
You're right, there was an engineer. So that was Joseph Bazalgette, who developed the London sewer system. But it was the father of epidemiology who was able to identify that there was a link between cholera outbreaks and the wells that were contaminated by sewer.
I can't recall his name.
John Snow.
The tune of Game of Thrones is in my head now. One of the worst commanders in the history of fictional medieval battles.
You're not a fan of Jon Snow?
He was a fundamentally useless commander. Every battle, he was hopeless.
And devoid of charisma.
Devoid of any charisma at all.
And I think that's why we've not seen much of whatever the actor's name is since then. Have we?
No, I don't think he's starred in anything.
He's disappeared without a trace because he's shit. He's just a shit actor. Like, he has no screen presence.
He must have realised then that I've got 6 years now, 6 years of playing this character in this story before I'm going to disappear off the face of the acting earth.
Yeah. So the Great Stink was because as the population of London, so this is in the 1850s, as the population of London went gangbusters and there was no meaningful sewage system at all, people were just, cesspits were piling up, small rivers were being used as sewers, flowing down into the Thames, filling it up with poo, making it stink, and it was barely endurable. And the reason why the sewage system was created was because the Houses of Parliament are right on the Thames, and the MPs could not bear it any longer, so they passed legislation providing the large sums of money necessary for Bazalgette to make this extraordinary sewage system on which London still depends.
That's one fact I didn't realise. The parliamentary angle isn't one that I'd heard.
Yeah. Question 3, how many people died during the building of the Panama Canal, and what did they die from?
I don't know the numbers, so I'm going to just pluck something out of the air. I'm going to say 80,000 people died. I know that's a ridiculously huge number.
No, it's not that ridiculous, but
and I'm going to say malaria.
Malaria's, that's a reasonable guess. It was malaria, yellow fever, and dysentery. I believe it was only about 25,000 in total, and most of those died. So the French had to go at the Panama Canal. The guy who did the Suez Canal, he went, I can, Suez Canal, Panama Canal, what's the difference?
It's a canal.
It's a canal, I can do it. And he was sort of, he was getting on a bit, and he was sort of, his countrymen loved him. He thought, I can't remember his name, sorry. And he thought, well, I'll go and do the Panama Canal. And he stuffed it up, and 20,000 people, mostly labourers from the Caribbean, died of these various diseases. So the French gave up. And then the Americans came in about 20 years later, about 1905. And about 5,000 of their labourers died, but they were able to get these diseases under control and obviously complete the canal.
Amazing.
A neurological disease this time. In the 2000 film Memento, in which Guy Pearce does a fantastic job. Do you remember that film?
Is this where he forgets everything beyond 5 minutes or something or other? I can't recall.
Yeah. Well, you've answered the question really. So the main character suffers from Korsakoff syndrome, which is, so it's the inability to form new memories. So you have this sort of short-term memory that is in one part of the brain, but the brain has to then transfer the information to another part of the brain, which stores it as long-term.
And that piece is missing.
Yeah, the ability to do that is lost in the form. So Oliver Sacks talks about Korsakoff syndrome. And remember that book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, where it's a series of essays about, because Oliver Sacks, the neurologist, who was the subject of that film Awakenings back in the 90s, I think. Am I?
Not one I've seen,
Okay.
sorry.
With Robin Williams and Robert De Niro. It's a good film.
Okay, I'll check it out.
And so I'd recommend the book too, because as a neurologist, he was looking at some very unusual forms of neurological disorder, and one of them was Korsakoff's, where he was talking to a guy. So I think this was in the 70s, and he was talking to a guy who thought it was 1945. And whenever you presented a newspaper to him that said 1972, he would just freak out. But then he took the newspaper away. Within a few minutes, he'd forgotten that it ever happened and would return to thinking it's 1945.
Wow, what a bizarre and difficult way to live.
Yes,
I
don't recommend it. But I mean, the book's interesting because he looks at all of these very bizarre neurological disorders, and you really do think, my God, how could the brain possibly break in that particular way? That seems extraordinary. But,
yeah. God.
A good book. And Memento was one of Christopher Nolan's early films. An overrated director, if I may be so bold as to say. I just want to put it out there. I know that's a controversial view, Chris, but a timely view.
Come on. He resurrected Batman. They were brilliant.
They were
absolutely brilliant.
I only saw the first half of one of those films. I thought this is a ludicrous undertaking.
Oh my God! You got to see The Dark Knight Rises.
No, I'm not going to see that.
Absolutely
Never,
extraordinary
ever
film.
See that. I might watch Oppenheimer.
You got to see it.
But Memento is good. I thought that was a nice little idea. But anyway, question 5, and Guy Pearce. I'm a big fan of Guy Pearce.
Yeah, he's very good, very competent, and he plays such a diversity of roles as well.
Yeah, and he seems like a nice bloke. I saw him interviewed. I think Juliet Zimmer did that. She does that series Home Delivery. Mm-hmm. Is that what it's called? Yeah, Home Delivery, where they take you back. Do you live in the real world?
No, I just don't watch enough TV or something. I'm not sure what's going on here.
Well, she takes relatively well-known people back to where they were raised, their childhood homes and schools and universities and stuff. And he just came over as a really down-to-earth, lovely guy.
Okay, it's kind of nice that people are still grounded despite their fame.
Yes, that's right. Question 5, final one. The following people have died from what disease? And this is an easy one, I think. It's an easy one. George Orwell, John Keats, Anton Chekhov, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Emily Bronte.
They died of tuberculosis?
Correct. Very good. And what was particularly disturbing was that Emily was, Emily Bronte was one of 4 siblings. There was Anne, Charlotte, Emily, all authors. They also had a brother, Branwell, who's he was a bit dissolute, but he was a poet, painter, and so forth. And 3 out of the 4 of them died of TB, and the one that didn't...
3 out of 4, my goodness.
All relatively young. The only one who didn't die of TB was Charlotte. She died during pregnancy of her pregnancy.
Oh, jeepers creepers. That's an incredibly tragic tale.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, and TB is relevant, of course, to our topic today because it's a bacterial infection. And in fact, George Orwell was being treated for TB just after the war. He died in 48, 49. He was one of the first people to get antibiotics, but he died anyway. And I think it's because he had an allergic reaction to it. So they weren't actually able to give him enough. And I actually was looking up famous people who have died from tuberculosis. Go to Wikipedia. It's a massive list.
But loads of people died.
Yeah. So if you got TB before the invention of antibiotics, you only sort of 50-50 chance of survival. In 1815, it was the cause of 1 in 4 deaths.
Incredible, really.
And the number, as I said, so this list of famous people on Wikipedia who died of TB just goes on and on and on. It's just,
You really don't appreciate how fortunate we are to be living in this era of modern medicine. Yes. My God.
And it had a sort of not nickname as such back in the day.
That was what I was trying to think before. It's a really it's like I'm suffering from that memento disease. I swear to God.
Can you remember the name of the memento disease?
No, I can't. God damn it! It's
called Korsakoff syndrome.
Yeah.
And the tuberculosis is known as
consumption.
Yeah. Any idea why it was called that?
No.
Severe weight loss was often a symptom.
Okay. So the body was consuming itself effectively.
And not a nice disease.
Really grim. Really grim.
Yeah,
it's a grim start to our podcast.
And of course, TB it's not been eradicated. Anyway, so
let's go back to the invention of, the discovery, I should say, of penicillin.
Yes, let's talk about that. So prior to the discovery and use of it, a simple scratch could kill you. If you just got a cut or a scrape or a blister or anything like that, really, you could end up in what was called a sepsis ward, where you just died of septicemia. I don't need to tell you that would be very unpleasant, and you'd be in a ward where everyone else is dying, and there's really nothing that medicine at the time could do about it. So,
speaking of grim, my goodness.
That's right. So apart from TB, we're looking at diseases such as typhoid, strep throat, venereal diseases of various kinds, pneumonia, to name a few. And in fact, my mother was one of the early beneficiaries of penicillin, in that she got pneumonia when she was relatively young. So she was born just towards the end of the war, and I think about 10 years later she got pneumonia and got penicillin, survived.
It would have only just been made fairly widespread by that point,
yeah.
I think.
Yeah. And of course there were some alarming treatments for bacterial infections prior to antibiotics, including arsenic and mercury, that were often extremely harmful to patients. So the three men involved, as I've mentioned, Fleming, Chain and Florey, we owe them a debt of gratitude. And as I will be explaining, it's not just them. They tend to get the credit because they were the ones who won the joint Nobel Prize. So a bit later I'll talk about the other people who were involved. But first of all, let's talk about Fleming. So Alexander Fleming was a Scottish bacteriologist. I think most people would be aware of this.
Famous story, isn't it, really?
Famous story,
yeah.
And it is true, apparently. This isn't myth. So 1928, he left a whole bunch of petri dishes out containing various bacteria, and he hadn't got around to clean them up. He went away on holiday, came back to discover that one of them was covered in a particular kind of mould. And it wasn't just any mould. It was, of course, it was Penicillium notatum. And what he noticed was that the bacteria around this particular mould had been killed by a substance that the fungus had excreted, which he was able to identify, and he named penicillin. He didn't just leave it there. He did conduct a series of tests to confirm that the substance had antibacterial properties. But what he was not able to do was to extract and purify the penicillin components and so make it medically useful. But what he did do is publish an article about his findings in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology.
But it kicked off the race, really, from there to do something with it, I suspect.
No, it was...
Really?
No one really paid any attention to
Just
it.
sat on the shelf,
the
the article.
It was largely ignored until Ernst Chain came along exactly 10 years later. So let's talk about them. Ernst Chain was a German Jew who had fled Germany because of Nazism. And in 1938, Howard Florey, an Australian scientist who was working in England, brought together a team of research scientists, including Chain, at the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology at Oxford. And the team were looking for a new project. And then it was Chain, not Florey, who came across Fleming's article. And he suggested to Florey that they consider penicillin.
We're already up to serendipity number 2 there, aren't we? Really?
Yes,
My goodness.
yeah, the fact that they're looking for something to focus on. And luckily Chain was able to recognise that this was potentially something that... And Florey too, of course. Both of them recognised that this was something that had a great deal of potential. So together with a biochemist called Norman Heatley, this Oxford team started to work on purifying and separating those active components of the mould that would make it medically useful. Now, to do that, so you remember that this is the third... So we're getting into the war by this point. And I assume that the war would have had an influence of their decision to pursue this, because they would have recognised the need for a medicine that could treat wounds that would otherwise lead to amputations and death, particularly in combat, as you can imagine, where wounds are going to get infected.
Yeah, I was going to say, how many soldiers die of their wounds later and of infection of those wounds later? Yeah. I mean, it must be massive. It must be more than die directly from the physical trauma, surely. Yeah.
The problem with penicillin is that extracting it from the mould itself is hard. And you can only generally get very small amounts. So a lot of the work lay in working out how to do that at a level that would make it industrially productive, where you could then, turn it into a medicine that was of widespread availability. So they developed this sort of rather absurd contraption made up of tubes, and they had to produce a lot of sort of mouldy liquid and cultivate the mould in a...
I do wonder, I'd love to know what the proportions are in terms of quantity of mold
Yes.
/ moldy water to the amount of penicillin that you produce.
Well,
I'd love to have an idea of what that equation looks like.
Well, they had to sort of Shanghai bedpans and any conceivable vessel that could contain moldy liquid, and then hook it all together into this bizarre contraption. Then they hired 6 young women called the Penicillin Girls, which is a term that would only have been used back in the day, to sort of keep an eye on all this, keep it all happening, and then keep the medium heat, at the right temperature, cultivating the mold. And so it was a large, unwieldy, probably quite smelly contraption from which, over a period of time, they were able to produce small quantities of penicillin.
Would have been very exciting, though. I mean, so much of science is small these days. When you're out there looking at enormous vats and huge teams of people working around the clock, heating things up and pumps running and whatever else, it would have been actually pretty exciting to see this behemoth of an experiment going on.
Yes, it would have been interesting to know how excited they were by it, or whether they felt it genuinely had potential or not, or whether or not it could be done. So in the end, there were many, many rooms in this laboratory where they were working just full of these sort of hidden, these containers containing the
Where was
disgusting
this,
mold.
by the way? Oxford University, thank you. Yeah.
But, they weren't producing the output necessary. So they conducted tests on mice, and this was actually the exciting moment where they realised that it was actually working. They were deliberately, of course, infecting mice with bacterial infections, and then they were treating the mice with small quantities of penicillin, and there was a particular point where they realised, my God, this actually works. This isn't just theoretical, this is working.
The mice weren't keeling over, they weren't...
They were responding to treatment.
Wow.
The first human being on whom they tested it was a 43-year-old policeman who had scratched his cheek while pruning roses and had developed septicemia.
My God!
So this is...
Jeepers.
I mean, it's hard to believe, isn't it?
It is hard to believe. Scratched his cheek on a rose thorn or something like that, and keeling over because of it, potentially.
And he was in a sepsis ward. I've seen a documentary with Michael Mosley did a series where he was looking at this, and there were photos or film of this poor man. He looked appalling. It's very hard to describe just what sepsis can do to a human being.
It's such a frivolous injury. To cause such grievous, harm. I think that example in itself should really kind of drive home to anyone listening to this, and certainly to me, how incredibly...
How precious. Antibiotics are.
Incredible. For sure.
And we'll be getting to that a bit later. So what happened was they gave him some penicillin, and they found to their delight, and no doubt his, that he was responding to it. He began to feel quite a bit better. But the problem was they didn't have enough. And what they had also discovered was that the body excretes penicillin very, very quickly, within a few hours, and it comes out through the urine. So what they had to do was extract from his urine the penicillin and then re-inject him in the hope of... because they weren't producing enough. And within a relatively short period of time, he relapsed. And unfortunately, he died before they could produce enough penicillin to cure him.
The only silver lining there is they realised then that it was going to work in human beings. Very clearly.
Yes.
They needed to recover fully.
That
That completely makes sense.
You need a full recovery just to demonstrate it. Yes, so this was during the Second World War. They still hadn't developed a technique for developing enough penicillin ahead of D-Day, which, as I said before, was the deadline. So,
and they were still sort of a couple of years out from... they were...
Yes, they were a couple of years out. Yeah. So they had time, but it was going to take a seismic shift in the way that penicillin was produced in order for that to happen. And how that was brought about is something we're going to be covering in the second half. But before that, Chris, I want to hear from you.
All right, Conan. Well, for today's intermission, look, this is a pretty heavy topic. The development of penicillin, the grievous harm of disease and so on sort of caused to human beings. So I'm going to go somewhere else. What I thought might be interesting is just to cover off on weird and wacky treatments in the past that have been applied, generally to no success. That's why they're kind of weird and wacky. And you may, in fact, be gobsmacked by some of the ideas that were put forward as medicine. And it's interesting, a lot of this occurred kind of in the 1800s, early 1900s, and I think medicine started to shift quite dramatically once we kind of turned last century.
Yeah.
But prior to that, it was all sorts of
quackery.
So in the late 19th century, there was a belief that milk would be the perfect substitute for blood, right? Because of the fatty oils and so on would make it perhaps appropriate to replace blood cells. So there was only a couple of instances of this procedure where milk was effectively transfused with blood, I presume to replace blood or infected blood or whatever the case is. It was wholly unsuccessful and patients died.
But it wasn't sustained, was it?
It wasn't. No. There was only a couple of examples where this was actually tried and the patients basically all died. Other dodgy cures. There was something that was being advertised around the turn of last century, or maybe just prior. A soothing syrup. Lots of things were being advertised to cure what ails you back in those days.
Yeah.
And this one was specifically aimed at babies. It was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. So it was a popular remedy for babies that are suffering from colic or diarrhea and other things. Upon sort of looking into this further, it became very clear it basically consisted of alcohol and morphine. It was completely and utterly admonished by anyone who knew what they were doing. But this is the sort of malarkey that was going on.
Yeah.
Another one. This is from Australia. It was an article in 1899. The reports there was a hotel in Australia where you could go to treat arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis. Essentially, this is ridiculous. You'd go to this hotel, Twofold Bay. There was near a whaling station. Is it sounding familiar? So what they would do is they get the carcass of these whales and they cut up slices of this carcass. Yep. And if you suffered from arthritis, they'd cut a big hole in the carcass and they just plop you in to the carcass for a couple of hours because apparently it relieved inflammation and soreness and other things.
Twofold Bay, I think that's where, as you say, there's a whaling station there. That's where they used orcas.
Is that the one down near Eden?
Yeah,
Is that Twofold Bay?
I think that's Twofold Bay.
Oh, yeah, orcas were used to round up the whales.
Yeah.
I mean,
so there's a sort of symbiotic relationship between the whalers and these orcas.
Anyone who has a chance get down to Eden on the south coast of New South Wales, please do so. The museum there is fascinating. It covers off on all of these aspects, including that symbiosis between people, the whalers, and killer whales.
Because I think the arrangement was that the orcas would get to have the tongues and lips of these were sperm whales, were they, or
humpbacks? Yeah, I think they must.
So they would get the tongues and lips or something, and the humans would get the rest.
So, how do you reckon this was discovered?
Was someone swallowed by a whale and they emerged with their arthritis cured?
No, it's a very Australian discovery. A drunken man was staggering along the beach near the station, walked over near the dead whale that was all cut open, and fell basically headfirst into the decomposing whale. And apparently he came out a changed man. Okay, enemas. Okay, smoke enemas. So the tobacco industry was pushing the health benefits, as you know, of its product for a long time, even when the counter view was very much well known. Smoke enemas were a big thing. It was considered to be a treatment for cholera. A smoke enema, essentially what they did was they would boil up tobacco-infused water, and they would just administer...
Oh, so it's liquid.
Administer it as a liquid, that's right. And the suggestion was that hundreds of lives have been saved by this. Clearly, it's a load of bollocks. And I doubt very much it saved any at all. But enemas were...
But it took your mind off the cholera.
It certainly did take your mind off the cholera. But, for the last few hundred years, well, certainly until the beginning of last century, and perhaps even now, enemas were well known as something that was therapeutic. At least that was the idea. They would mix herbs and so on in the enema. It would cure things like constipation. Fair enough, but like so many medicines, they start designed to cure one thing, and then suddenly they're curing everything that ails you.
They get overexcited,
100%. And so they did this for obviously they did this for a long time. It was very popular in high society. Back in the 1700s, 1600s, and so on. People had multiple enemas a day, right? Yeah. Those that could afford it. And indeed, Louis XIV of France is said to have had more than 2,000 enemas in his lifetime.
Yeah.
The seat of power, mate. The seat of power.
Wow, that's... And I saw an episode of QI that there was... that bellows were provided on the banks of the Thames for people who had come across, who, if you wanted to save someone from drowning, and you drag them out of the water, and if they're not breathing, then you stick bellows up their bum and literally blow smoke up their arse as a way of reviving them.
And how many were revived in that fashion?
Well, it'd be interesting. I mean, again, I think it would, if you were in any way likely to regain consciousness, having that done to you would certainly rouse you into an alert state. Very little attention was given to the lungs. It was all about the other end. Very bizarre.
They're a little bit obsessed with the butt, weren't they?
Yeah.
Just a little bit obsessed with it. Cure all. So, stuttering in the 18th and 19th century,
Yep.
How do you think they cured that?
I imagine pain or shock of some kind.
Cutting off half of the stutterer's tongue.
Oh, no.
I know. Surprisingly, it didn't work. Hitler,
Yeah.
right? He was a known hypochondriac.
Yeah.
In order to vitalise him, he would be injected with vitamins, often laced with crystal meth.
Was it actually crystal meth, really?
Crystal meth, absolute methamphetamines. Apparently the Third Reich were actually quite big users of what would now be illicit drugs.
Yeah.
I think for sure cocaine and crystal meth and other things. And apparently it helped keep him fresh, alert, active, and ready for the day. Cheerful and talkative.
Ready for the day.
Physically active and tending to stay awake long hours into the night.
Yes.
I mean, he was a bit of a shell of a man, obviously, by the time he was hunkering down in Berlin. But I suspect maybe some of this played at least a part in his
I have heard that
erraticness.
he had like a doctor on hand all the time who was just giving him all of this, not just that, but a lot of crazy stuff just to indulge Hitler's obsession with his health. Now, well, thank you, Chris. I mean, and it's interesting that you talk about that point probably around about 1900 or so, where before then, so if you had a sickness, going to a doctor, you were more likely to come out worse off.
Exactly. I mean, basic germ theory wasn't well
They didn't
understood
know germ
before.
theory. They were bleeding you at a point where you really needed all of your blood. Whereas after that point, after about 1900, it started to be beneficial to go to the doctor. And so it was
Because there was a scientific method associated.
And might I suggest that if anyone is in London, they go to the old surgical museum. This is a museum near London Bridge, and you can see the operating table that was made of wood, where people were operated on without anaesthetic and without any kind of attempt to keep the area clean at all.
And it was one of the earliest operating theatres, is it?
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's certainly one of the oldest that's surviving. If you want to know more about this, go to my website, and I've written an article on it, and you can read about it. Did you know I had a website, Chris?
Yeah, I knew you had a website.
Yeah, it's very exciting. It's conanelphick.com. So go there and just click on the travel writing menu, and you'll find it.
I look forward to reading it, Conan.
So, right, thank you for that, Chris. Let's get back into antibiotics.
Let's do that.
So when war was declared in 1939, the Oxford team weren't able to get enough support to begin large-scale manufacture and testing in Britain, despite the obvious potential for the drug.
Not when there's perfectly good tanks to make and other things, I guess.
Yeah, and I don't know whether this was just the failure of the British authorities to recognise the potential in it, or whether it was simply they just didn't have the money. Because obviously Britain was just on its last legs financially. The war was crippling it. It didn't really have the resources to throw this. So instead, the team under Florey went to the American government, and it was the US who agreed to begin producing penicillin at a laboratory in Illinois. They also conducted further research looking at new strains that would provide higher outputs and make enough of the drug available for Allied troops ahead of D-Day.
You know, it's interesting. Like how many times have we mentioned in our podcast that so-and-so went to the US in order to make this thing on a mass scale?
Yes.
To industrialise, to commercialise, and so on. I mean, this is very specific.
Yes,
and there's good reason why
and
it's
sort
the
of
case.
and getting back to overrated Christopher Nolan, this connects with the Manhattan Project indirectly, in the sense that America had the resources for the Manhattan Project. It had the resources for things like developing penicillin. It had the industrial might behind it that made it possible for it to prevail against Germany and Japan. And for that matter, things like the bomber from which the atom bomb was dropped, the
Enola Gay.
Enola Gay, so not the specific bomber, but the kind of bomber, the Super Fortress. That was a colossally expensive project. designing and building those on sort of scale that could obliterate Japan, building that type of bomber alone cost more than the Manhattan Project.
Really?
Yeah.
Building the planes costs more than building the bomb.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
That is extraordinary. Yeah.
So America just had this sort of remarkable amount of money at its disposal, which made it possible. And it's at this point that we can talk about the Americans who played a significant role in this. Oh, by the way, when they were looking for, they found the best strain of penicillin mold growing on a rock melon at a farmer's market. So they were just looking around.
Growing on a what? Sorry.
On a rock melon.
Rock melon. Sorry,
yes.
okay.
So it's my R's and W's. So a cantaloupe, as the Americans called it. Experimented with all different types of...
Can you imagine them running around farmers' markets going, that's mouldy. Yep, that's mouldy. I'll pick that up. Yep.
That's what they were kind of... That's how they did it.
Gosh, it's actually genuinely... call me a nerd. This is an exciting story from a science point of view and everything else.
And it was American pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer also began producing penicillin. So we need to mention here Jasper H. Cain was a Pfizer scientist who suggested using deep tank fermentation as a way of producing it at an industrial scale. But there was a chemical engineer who made that possible, and her name was Margaret Hutchinson Rousseau. And you can imagine how few female chemical engineers were around at the time.
100%.
She was extraordinarily gifted and did quite a few other brilliant things in her career too. So she made it possible. And of course, no one's heard of her really. There is a brief Wikipedia entry about it.
I think you're right. Other than the three primary people at the beginning that won the Nobel Prize, I have to admit, I've not heard of any of the others.
No.
Yeah.
And there were others too involved in this process. So the upshot of all this is that penicillin, the Americans in particular, using the work that had been done by Florey's team, were successful in producing industrial quantities of penicillin ahead of D-Day, which saved countless lives. It's considered to be one of the contributing factors to the Allied victory, actually, because it meant that men who would otherwise had to have limbs amputated and therefore would be taken out of combat permanently, or, of course, who died, could be sent back into combat.
I wonder, that's fascinating. I wonder what it meant for the German side. They were all just keeling over as per normal.
Yeah.
They were good on the rockets and everything else, and jet engines and all those other incredible things that the Germans developed at the time, but rubbish at the medicine. They're too busy focused on shooting Hitler up with methamphetamine.
Quite. Yeah, and it's a sort of pleasing irony that Ernst Chain, a German Jew, was responsible for helping defeat Nazism. Now, of course, immediately after the war, it began to be rolled out for civilians. And do you want to take a guess as to the first country to benefit?
Australia?
Correct, yes. And I don't know whether that was anything to do with Florey or not. You would think it was the US.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and the development of penicillin obviously opened the door to the discovery of a number of new types of antibiotics, most of which are still used today to treat common illnesses. So in 1945, Fleming, Florey and Chain received the Nobel Prize in Medicine. And Harold Florey has also been recognised in many other ways in Australia. There's a suburb here in Canberra named after him. His likeness was on the $50 note for a while. Before
the paper note, potentially.
Yes, the paper note.
It's been a long time since I've seen a paper note. I would not have had a clue.
But this is an interesting quote from Florey. Let's hear from him. So in 1967, this is what he said: "The three of us got it together. That's to say, Chain, Fleming, and me. And it was the first prize giving after the war, so the Swedes put on a tremendous occasion. It's very, very gratifying indeed. But one should always realise that there's a terrible lot of luck in this sort of thing." Which, Chris, is what you said before, serendipity, right? Yeah.
Very modest and appropriate way to approach it as well, I think. It's like, I can see it now. What is your sense now that you've received the Nobel Prize? Yeah, it all came down to me. Yes. All me. It was all me. Those other guys, well, they handed me the tools, but it was all me.
Riding on my coattails.
Indeed.
We happened to have hit an antibiotic which worked in man. We could have worked with hundreds of others, and they would have been chemical curiosities. As long as one realises that most Nobel Prize winners look on themselves as being extremely fortunate, I think that's all I need to say. Yeah, there you are.
It's great.
Very down-to-earth Aussie way of looking at things.
It's wonderful that an Australian had such a part to play in what was a fundamental step in modern medicine.
But look, I'll just touch briefly on the sobering reality of antimicrobial resistance if I may. And it's interesting that actually Florey predicted this. So antimicrobial resistance, obviously that's when bacteria evolve and become in reaction to overuse or misuse of antibiotics, so that antibiotics cease to work on certain strains of bacteria, which makes it very difficult to treat certain conditions. And Florey predicted this. His main concern was that people would not complete a full course of antibiotics, so that the bacteria would become resistant within an individual and that would spread. He probably didn't predict, though, the extent of the problem, where you have people around the world using it in livestock production.
Which I think is just extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, we've just taken this gift and abused the heck out of it.
Yeah.
Really have.
And they do that because in many cases, particularly in developing countries, but also in developed countries, livestock are kept in unsanitary conditions where they are liable to develop diseases, bacterial diseases. So if you just keep them perpetually dosed up with mild levels of antibiotics, and the idea is that prevents that. It also, unfortunately, fattens livestock up. So that's another incentive to continue to use. And antibiotics in many countries are quite cheap. Many countries, too, for human use, you can get them over the counter. And even when you can't, doctors, even in developed countries, often will just give them to patients to shut patients up, even when they know that the disease is probably a viral infection and therefore antibiotics have no use.
And it's interesting, I think, in terms of the pace of developing new antibiotics, we've hardly developed any new ones in the last kind of 20 or 30 years, maybe a couple.
Yes, and
versus
part of the
pace
reason
was
is
quite...
that there's no incentive for pharmaceutical companies to do it.
That's right, because, they'd rather invest their time and effort in developing something that you can take forever and continue to pay them. Indeed.
So, and we also need better regulation too. So, Chris, I'm just going to finish up here. One thing I haven't done before is just give a shout out to other podcasts, because we don't do advertising. This isn't a monetary exercise for us. This is, because we're exhibitionists, we like the sound of our own voices, but we also just want people to know about some of this stuff because it's interesting. So look, if you're into other podcasts, it's hard to believe, Chris, that the History Blokes would not be enough to meet the needs of all of our listeners, podcast-wise. But just in case that's true, The Rest is History is an English podcast. Its format isn't wildly different from ours, but I like to think ours is better. For a start, as we have said, we don't have ads. We're not promoting stuff throughout the podcast, which is what these guys have started to do, but nonetheless, they are very good and I would recommend them. Cautionary Tales with Tim Harford is good, using disasters in history around the world as a way of, and how we can learn from them. And finally, In Our Time, another British podcast with Melvyn Bragg, who's a famous British broadcaster. Very good. It's quite dry. He gets sort of academics in to talk about sort of quite weighty topics. It's meaty, but I enjoy it. I take away many a key learning from all of these podcasts.
So Conan.
Yes.
Thank you again for the research for this episode. I think I think we've learned a lot today. We've learned obviously a lot about the story that was already sort of familiar regarding Fleming and the trio that were involved and got the Nobel Prize. What I thought was really stood out for me is the ability to manufacture that at scale and to deliver a genuine benefit from a theoretical concept or an observation on a bookshelf. So I took away a lot from today, and if anything, it just speaks. You can have lots of good science around, but if you can't bring that to the people, then
yes, that's right. And as you said, a luck-dependent Chain reading that article and Fleming leaving his petri dishes out so that spores floated in.
Great. And so what do we have for the next episode?
The next episode is going to be a combo.
I like it.
We'll be looking at the
double header.
Double header, yes. We'll be looking at the Trans-Australian Railway, which obviously linked different parts of the continent and helped build the nation, as well as the Overland Telegraph, which did the same thing, but in a different way, obviously, but also connected the country with the rest of the world.
Great.
So, looking forward to that, Chris.
I look forward to it too.
And until then, goodbye from me.
Thanks for listening.